Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 13 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review. This time around I have 2 new Legendaries, a handful of the remaining Spellstones, and some overall just interesting new cards. So up first I'll be doing my detailed reviews, but if you don't have a lot of time, you can hit the quick review link in the description below, hop to the end of the video, and just see these card reveals really fast, along with my 1 to 5 star reviews. But for now, let's go ahead and jump into my detailed reviews. Up first, I have the new Paladin legendary weapon. This is Val'anyr, which will look a little familiar if you're a longtime World of Warcraft player. This is a 6-mana weapon with 4 attack, 2 durability, and a death rattle that reads, give a minion in your hand +4, +2, and then when it dies, you re-equip this. So just to provide some clarity on that death rattle, what that means is you're essentially hand buffing a minion in your hand whenever your Val'anyr naturally breaks after you use the charges or somebody removes it. And that weapon gets a +4, +2 buff, or that minion, excuse me, gets a +4, +2 buff. And when you play that minion, it also has a death rattle that reads re-equip Val'anyr. So essentially, you get to cycle Val'anyrs forever if you actually keep that minion unsilenced and are successfully able to kill it with that buff active. Then you just kit Val'anyr into a buff, into a minion, into a death rattle, into Val'anyr, into a buff, into a minion, etc., etc. The chain could theoretically continue as long as you have a new minion in your hand to apply that buff. So clearly, the amount of raw value with Val'anyr is almost theoretically infinite. You can get some crazy chains of buffs happening, not to mention, of course, just a free 4/2 weapon all the time as well. So this is only a 6-mana card. It's a 4/2, so obviously a little overcosted. A 4/2 would normally be like 3.5 to 4 mana. You could compare it to things like True Silver, right? So you're paying 2 mana for this effect. And frankly, even if it just hits once, that +4, +2, and the death rattle, that's incredible. Like, that's a +4, +2 buff is worth a couple mana points, and another 4/2 weapon is worth even more mana, about 3.5, right? The only real downside to this card is silence effects. If your opponent silences that minion that you play, then you're not going to get your Val'anyr back. You're not going to obviously benefit from the stats, and you've paid a little bit of extra mana, basically 2 to 3 mana extra, to elicit a silence from your opponent. And frankly, I think even that is a reasonable outcome. There's a lot of silenceable targets in Paladin. Your opponent normally will run 1 to 2 silences, maybe the meta shifts. Even if they run 3 to 4, any card that exhausts silences in Paladin becomes more and more powerful. The power escalates because there are so many other Paladin cards that also benefit from silences. And frankly, Val'anyr is one of those you just have to silence. Like, you can't keep giving your opponent a hand buff like that for free and a death rattle that just gives them more and more weapon value because they just keep swinging, they just keep hand buffing, the chain goes on forever. Now, the real downside with Val'anyr, of course, is not just the silence, it's also a little slow. In other words, you do kind of pay that 2 to 3 mana penalty right off the bat when you play Val'anyr. It's only a weapon right away. You have to swing a couple times to get that activation. So if your opponent doesn't remove it, and they'll be discouraged from removing it most of the time, then the turn you play it, it's a pretty slow turn. You have to swing that turn. Hopefully you swing into something good. Then you have to swing the next turn. That activates your hand buff. Then you have to be able to play that minion that turn. If it's more than 7 mana, for instance, if you played all this on curve, you might have to wait a turn or 2. If it's a small thing, which is more likely, then you might be able to play it right away. But then that minion has to die, and your opponent might be discouraged from killing it, so you have to wait another turn to kill that minion. So you can see there's a really long delay, basically, before all of this value starts to accrue and starts to pile up. So you're committing quite a bit of mana to long-term effects. Now, Paladin can be played, certainly in a control environment, and that's, I think, the only way Val'anyr is ever going to work. You wouldn't want to do this in even probably a mid-range deck, because I think it just takes too long to start snowballing, and you need to be a little faster and a little more aggressive with all of your plays, really making sure you dump stats on the board as quickly as you can. And a weapon like this wouldn't be quite as good as something even like Vine Cleaver, for instance, which is just consistently pumping out stuff. This takes longer, more mana commitments, and to really get the excessive value from this one, it's 3, 4, 5 turns down the road. So a specific kind of deck has to use this, which is a slower Paladin, in my mind. But that said, I think a slower paladin can absolutely use this, and control paladin has been a successful archetype as, you know, tier 2, tier 3 deck throughout much of Hearthstone's history. So I do think Val'anyr is good in that sort of context, and I do think that that sort of context will be playable. So I expect we're going to see some Val'anyr, and I think this is one of the better legendary weapons we've seen so far. So now let's move on to the new Druid legendary. This is Ixlid, the Fungal Lord. This is a new 5-mana minion. It's a 2/4 elemental, and it reads, after you play a minion, summon a copy of it. Now this isn't really a minion type we've seen before, and honestly it's a little bit hard to gauge just how successful this one's going to be. Clearly, when it works, you can get some really powerful tempo plays. If you slam an Ixlid and you slam, for instance, 2 0-mana Arcane Giants, then you're going to dump 4 8/8s onto the board for only 5 mana. That's a completely ridiculous board that most opponents would have difficulty removing. Of course, there are the Brawls and the Twisting Nethers, and now the Psychic Screams of the world. So even that sort of commitment to the board might be punished in today's Hearthstone, but there are other ways to utilize this thing too. You could use Death Rattle minions to give your board a little more stickiness. You could do things like Quest Druid, where you have a ton of 0-mana stuff. Everything is 0 mana and you just create absurd value. You could do combos with like Kuhn and Aviana in Wild to do some silly Malygos shenanigans where you copy multiple Malygos in order to enable a ton of burst damage. There's a lot of possibilities. If you think for the moon, like if you dream big with this card, some crazy things can happen. And I think that's important to remember. Like, there's always opportunities for cards like this to find some home where they're creating an opportunity that otherwise can't exist. For instance, even just Ixlid into Leroy Jenkins, for instance, is like a 10 mana, 12 damage burst combo. Now, that might not be the goal of the card in your deck, but if you run a Leroy, it might be a second opportunity to use this, right? Some other way to elicit value out of this card. So, ultimately, what I'm getting at is that I think Ixlid has some fundamental issues in that it's a very slow card. It costs 5 mana, and then you have to do something else with it in order to accomplish anything valuable. And often that thing you're trying to do is something that's going to happen in the late game. Like Arcane Giants take a while to get discounted. It takes a while to get your quest active. So I rarely think this is a turn 5 sort of card. It's probably something much farther down the road. It also, of course, has a very low stat count for a 5-drop, so it's not something you can play preemptively and hope it sticks to the board, because your opponent will almost always find a way to kill it. That's similar to something like Bran Bronzebeard, right? We've seen that before with Bran, and this even comes later in the game when your opponent is even more likely to have stuff to deal with this. So I don't, in other words, think that this is a like one of legendary, sort of the Fandral Staghelm style of Druid legendary that a lot of decks can make work. I think instead this is probably something that is relegated to more combo-oriented decks that are doing some sort of specific shenanigan, trying to use Ixlid to create some sort of combo or opportunity that wouldn't otherwise be possible. I don't think this works very well in things like Jade Druid, for instance, because it's play a minion, not summon a minion, and a lot of the Jade cards are summoned. It's too slow for token as we see it now, so I do think this has to be in some sort of deck we've never seen before. On average, a weak card, but playable to the extent that it does cool stuff and can be a part of really powerful combos as well. So not a completely awful card, just a difficult one to use, a challenging one to find homes for, and therefore probably going to end up being something like a 2-star card, as you'll see at the end of the video. So up next I have a few Spellstones. Up first is the Hunter Spellstone. This is the Lesser Emerald Spellstone, a 5-mana spell that reads summon 2 3/3 wolves, and then you can upgrade this Spellstone by merely playing a secret, which is one of the easier activations I think we've had so far of all the Spellstones. It's really not hard to play secret, that's just 2 mana. And if you get the upgraded version, you then summon 3 3/3 wolves, and then the final version allows you to summon 4 3/3 wolves. And I have to say, I think this card is actually fairly good. First and foremost, summoning 2 3/3 wolves isn't that bad for 5 mana. It's not a play you'd often want to make, but that's, 6/6 in total stats for 5 mana. They're going to be beasts, which is, synergist with Hunter. Hunter doesn't have that many good 5-drops. Sometimes you feel a little awkward running Bittertide Hydras or Tundra Rhinos. Like, neither one necessarily always fits your deck. There are some advantages to multiple bodies. There are some advantages to the fact that this is a spell. For instance, you could see this working really well in the new big Hunter archetype that seems like Blizzard is designing towards, with things like Katharina and cards that benefit from recruiting specifically beasts in your deck and only big beasts. So you might need early cost and mid cost cards that summon other minions via spells, like Animal Companion and now Lesser Emerald Spellstone, both accomplish that sort of goal. So I like where it's at from a design space standpoint, from a mana cost standpoint, and it very quickly ramps into value. Like 3 for 3/3 Wolves is pretty solid for 5 mana. And then finally 4 3/3 Wolves is just a huge board. Now, obviously, 3/3 Wolves are fairly susceptible to all kinds of different AoE effects, but if you're only committing 5 mana, and you're normally doing this probably on an empty board or a board without a ton of stuff already, then you're not going to feel that bad if your opponent does use some sort of removal to deal with it. It's not like you're committing 9 mana for Call of the Wild, for instance. It's kind of similar in a lot of ways, just dumping stats onto the board. Now, clearly, Call of the Wild, you get a charging minion, and there's some instant benefit there that's worth a lot, but still, at a 4 mana discount, you can see why they are comparable. And in fact, Greater Emerald Spellstone looks solid at its second and third phases in particular. Now, this does quite obviously require you to play secrets in your list. So this is not going to fit in every sort of Hunter. We wouldn't see it in mid-range Hunter as it's designed today because that deck doesn't run secrets. But again, in a big Hunter where you're looking for more cheap cards to play without playing a ton of cheap minions, secrets make sense. So I think this card's success right away will hinge a little bit on whether or not Big Hunter or some sort of Secret Hunter variation can become successful. If they don't, then you probably won't ever see this in Mid-Range Hunter because Secrets might not make a good fit, and it's not good enough necessarily to compromise your deck list by running Secrets. But if those two archetypes, if either Secret Hunter or Big Hunter as archetypes succeed, I do think Lesser Emerald Spellstone would fit really nicely. And if you just look at this from a raw value standpoint, like, is it a good card? Do the numbers make sense? I think absolutely so. I like this one quite a bit. So I have some high hopes for Lesser Emerald Spellstone. So now let's move on to the new Priest Spellstone. This is the Lesser Diamond Spellstone, a 7 mana spell that allows you to resurrect 2 different friendly minions. Oh boy. And this one can be upgraded after you cast 4 spells, and then it allows you to cast or resurrect 3 minions, and then finally the final form, again after casting 4 spells, allows you to resurrect 4 different friendly minions. So clearly this card was designed with an eye towards what we call Big Priest, a deck that's all about cheating out very scary large minions via Barns and Shadow Essence, killing those minions off, or forcing your opponent to kill them off often because they have taunt, and then resurrecting them really efficiently using, of course, Eternal Servitude and in Wild things like Resurrect. Lesser Diamond Spellstone essentially gives you another way to resurrect those big scary minions at a very large discount. So if you, for instance, resurrected 2 Obsidian statues for 7 mana, that would be a very strong play. 2 9 mana minions for 7 mana is a awfully large discount. And if you got 4, you've got a Lich King, a Ysera, and a couple Obsidian statues, that's a totally absurd 7 mana play. So you can see quite clearly how this fits into Big Priest. Now, despite how well it fits, I do think there are some challenges for this card in Big Priest. First off, in standard format, the list is pretty tight. There's not that much room for high-cost spells. You have to run enough removal, and of course the core pieces for summoning and resummoning your big minions, and of course the big minions, that there's not a ton of leeway as far as flex spots for cards. Although some lists do run a Free from Amber, and I think you could slot this in pretty nicely in the spot of Free from Amber and still accomplish things. The other side here is the upgrade cost is kind of high. Casting 4 spells might take 2 to 3 turns in Big Priest because you've got a lot of big removal spells in that deck, things like Dragonfire Potion, and you're often committing multiple turns with full mana cost. You're playing, a 4-cost Eternal Servitude or a 6-cost Dragonfire Potion. etc. So you're not able to do like 4 spells in a single turn. So I think it would often take 2 to 3 turns to upgrade this thing, sometimes even 4 or more turns if you're playing minions. So it's something that could sit dead in your hand for a long time, and that's already a risk for Big Priest, is cards that aren't removal just rotting away in their hand, and that could hurt the consistency of the deck and lower its win rate. So despite how well this fits, I think it's one of those cards you might have to see in action a little bit, because I have a feeling it could just be too slow and perhaps a little bit too unreliable, because remember, this can randomly spawn a Barnes as well. It's not a controlled resurrect like Eternal Servitude. I think it's designed for Big Priest, gives that deck some ammunition. Outside of Big Priest, I don't think this ever gets played. If you're resurrecting just random minions, that you get Northshire Clerics and Novice Engineers and Loot Hoarders and stuff in your pool, that's not nearly as strong. It's not a good 7-mana play. It's not something Priest would want to commit to. So this is one of those kind of one-trick pony Priest cards, and it may not even be good enough. So I think there's a chance a one of this card fits really nicely in a Big Priest. So I'm willing to give this a fairly decent score, but I do think it comes with some major risks and still might not fit into the only deck it potentially fits into in the first place. So up next for my third Spellstone here, I have the new Rogue Spellstone. This is the Lesser Onyx Spellstone, a new 5-mana spell that reads, destroy 1 random enemy minion, and then play 3 Death Rattle cards to upgrade the Lesser Onyx Spellstone, which then goes to 2 random enemy minions, and finally up to 3 random enemy minions. Now, honestly, even at its base level here, Lesser Onyx Spellstone has some playability. I think there's a lot of board states where there's just one crazy thing out there that you need to destroy, sort of that Deadly Shot style removal. And even at 5 mana, sometimes that doesn't feel bad. I know Deadly Shot's only 3, but still, it's an Assassinate at that point, and you're okay with Assassinate. Not a great rogue card necessarily, but playable. If you had to commit to Lesser Onyx Spellstone, sometimes you wouldn't feel awful about it. Clearly, as it upgrades, it gets much, much better. 2 and 3 minions are much more likely board states, and often that will just be a board clear in the mid-range meta of Hearthstone that we have today, and that would be very, very powerful. Now, the downside, as there always is with these Spellstones, with Lesser Onyx Spellstone in particular, is that you gotta play Death Rattle cards to upgrade this thing. So this only works in a Death Rattle deck. And right now, Death Rattle Rogue is just not an archetype that we ever see on the ladder. It's not a successful high-tier deck, and I don't really see that changing anytime soon. And in fact, I think Death Rattle Rogue gets even worse in the future when N'Zoth rotates out in the next expansion release. So that's only 4 months away. So it feels to me like Lesser Onyx Spellstone is kind of inextricably tied here to an archetype of Rogue that's currently not successful, and I think the likelihood of it becoming successful without things like the Raptor in the past just becomes more and more unlikely. So I don't know that this one's ever going to see play, because a normal deck does not run enough Death Rattles, like Tempo Rogue or Miracle Rogue. They don't run nearly enough Death Rattles to make this thing worth it. So to me, I think this one's just going to get left behind. It's not a fundamentally bad card necessarily from a effect to cost standpoint. It looks okay. It looks, in fact, solid. But since its upgrade cost is so restrictive and so narrow in its focus, I don't think we're going to see much play from Lesser Onyx Spellstone. And now finally I have one last card here. This is a new Warlock minion. This is the Possessed Lackey, a 5-mana 2/2 with a Death Rattle that reads Recruit a Demon. So when I look at this card, the first comparison that comes to mind for me is Scalemancer, the Knights of the Frozen Throne card. It's also a 5-mana 2/2 with a Death Rattle that summons you an 8/8 if the minion dies during your opponent's turn. This, of course, does not have that particularly sticky condition. This can die anytime, and the Death Rattle will still succeed. So that's clearly an upside over Scalemancer. Scalemancer, by the way, a card that has only barely ever scratched the surface of seeing play in constructed format, so not a model for a great card. And I think a lot of the challenges for Scalemancer exist also for the Possessed Lackey, and in fact, they're even harsher in some ways because this just recruits a demon, not an 8/8. And of course, demons aren't always giant 8/8s. Sometimes demons are 1/3 Voidwalkers. Now, clearly the idea with Possessed Lackey is to build your deck in a way that you don't include 1/3 Voidwalkers and you tutor out some sort of giant great demon, like maybe you only run Doom Guards and Mal'Ganis and Wild, or maybe just Doom Guards and the new Void Lord card in Standard. And then Possessed Lackey becomes much, much better. But there's still, I think, an issue here in that you're playing a 2/2 on turn 5 or later, and 2/2s just don't do very much, and your opponent essentially gets to ignore this minion for an entire turn. And then after you trade it in, you still don't necessarily get to attack with the minion you summon unless it's specifically a Doom Guard. So you just sort of leave that asset out there passively, and that can be a problem. It also, of course, requires you to build your deck in a very specific way, and we don't know that that's potentially a successful thing to do. It's constrictive, and it forces you to compromise how you want to build a list and probably make some sacrifices along the way. And I don't know that this effect is good enough or powerful enough, cheating out a minion like that, that it's worth those sacrifices. So I think this card has some fairly large challenges to overcome. How many demons do you run? Are there enough big demons? How slow is this card? It's a little susceptible to silence if you don't have other silence targets in your deck, because it seems like a silence meta might be a thing. So there are a handful of problems for this one. It doesn't look outstanding to me necessarily. It looks a little better than Scalemancer if you build it perfectly. If you build your deck perfectly, that is. And even then, I don't think that makes it a great card. So in the best of scenarios, this one just looks a little above average to me, and I don't think the best of scenarios is a very likely scenario. So I don't expect that we'll actually see Possessed Lackey too much. I think this one will fall behind. I don't see a deck forming around this one at all. And there you go, guys. That's it for my detailed reviews on these cards. So up next, what I'd like to do is jump into my quick reviews where I rate each of these from 1 to 5 stars. Val'anyr is a 4-star card. Ixlid Fungal Lord is a 2-star card. Lesser Emerald Spellstone is a 4-star card. Lesser Diamond Spellstone is a 3-star card. Lesser Onyx Spellstone is a 2-star card. And Possessed Lackey is a 2-star card. So there you have it, folks. That's part 13 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review. I'm curious what you guys think about these cards. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I always love hearing what you guys have to say. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.